We all know childhood trauma leaves scars. But what about the ones you can't see? Today, we're diving into a really powerful study that gets right to the heart of those hidden wounds, guided by the very professionals who see them every single day.
Okay, so first things first, what are we actually talking about when we use the word trauma? To make sure we're all on the same page, this study defines it as any event that's way outside the norm of everyday life, something that can trigger really severe stress and unhappiness. That's our foundation for this whole discussion.
And the insights we're about to unpack, they come straight from the front lines. The entire study is based on in-depth interviews with 9 professionals in Ireland. We're talking psychotherapists, addiction counselors, social care workers, people who are dealing with this day in and day out. All right, let's start with the things that the study confirmed, the consequences of trauma that, kind of line up with what we might already expect. And what they found, pretty much across the board, was that adults who'd gone through childhood trauma were almost always dealing with these 3 big issues: low self-esteem, depression, and anxiety. These aren't just fleeting feelings, they're those deep, internal scars that can really go on to shape a person's entire life. But here's where it gets really interesting. Those internal scars, they're often incredibly well hidden. One social care worker, a guy named Tom, pointed out that survivors can actually project this image of having really high self-esteem, but as he says, it's like a character they've built. The moment you start to chip away at it, the whole thing just collapses. And this isn't just all in their head. There's a real biological reason for this. The study points out that long-term stress in childhood can literally rewire the body's alarm system, what's known as the HPA axis. It basically gets stuck in the on position. This leaves a person in this constant state of high alert, which, as you can imagine, dramatically ramps up the risk for anxiety and depression. Okay, so that deep internal pain, it leads us to what is maybe the most significant and frankly surprising finding of the entire study: the masks people wear to get by. And this is where our common ideas about how people cope get completely flipped on their head. So you have to wonder, right? If the reality inside is all about worthlessness and constant anxiety, how do people even get through the day? How do they function in the world?
Well, here it is. This is the core discovery. The common assumption, what most of us probably think, is that survivors pull away. They self-isolate. But what this study found was often the complete opposite. They cope by building an entirely new persona, what the professionals call a false self.
So why? Why create a whole new self? Well, according to a psychotherapist named Tara, it's a deep-seated survival strategy. It all comes from a child's fundamental, desperate need to be loved by their parents. So if their true self is rejected or abused, they try to become the kind of child they think their parents will finally love. And this process, this building of a false self, it happens in stages. First, the child internalizes all that shame and self-hatred from the trauma. That creates this intense craving for the love and validation they never got. So they start to construct a new, acceptable personality for the outside world. And that new personality becomes a mask, to hide all those deep-down feelings of worthlessness. Now, the false self was a huge theme, but it wasn't the only coping mechanism they saw. Professionals also pointed to substance misuse and, of course, just straight-up denial that the trauma ever happened. And a lot of them also became people pleasers, which ties right back into that same heartbreaking search for someone, anyone, to approve of them. An addiction counselor, David, really didn't mince words about it. The reason for the drug and alcohol use, it's pretty simple. It's a tool. It's a way to numb a pain that is otherwise just unbearable. It's how you block it all out. Okay, let's zoom out for a second. We've seen the devastating impact on the individual. But how does that personal pain connect to bigger things like family patterns and even societal problems that can stop people from ever getting better? One concept that came up again and again was something called intergenerational trauma. This is huge. It's basically how the pain gets passed down. When trauma isn't resolved, those harmful behaviors and beliefs get passed from one generation to the next, often without anyone even realizing it. It just becomes normal for that family. And as a social care worker named Samantha pointed out, the damage is just so much worse when the trauma comes from a primary caregiver. Think about it. The one person who is supposed to keep you safe and love you unconditionally is the source of your pain. That just completely shatters a child's world. Now, here's a really critical point this study makes. Trauma itself doesn't discriminate. It is an equal opportunity wound.
It can happen to anyone, in any family, no matter how much money they have or where they live. But, and this is a huge but, the opportunity to heal from it, well, that's a different story.
Because the ability to heal, as it turns out, is massively influenced by money. David, the addiction counselor, lays it out plain and simple. If you have money, you get a service. But for people who are struggling financially, they face impossible waiting lists or, as he puts it, no help whatsoever. And that creates this huge, unjust gap between who gets to recover and who gets left behind. So, when you pull all these threads together, you really start to see just how complex this is. It's not one thing. It's this tangled web connecting all these internal feelings of shame and fear, with external coping methods like the false self or drug use, all wrapped up in systemic issues like financial barriers and the constant draining struggle to form relationships built on trust. So, looking at this incredibly complex web of challenges, it's a lot. Which brings us to the most important question. What does the path to healing actually look like? How can these devastating cycles finally be broken? Well, the professionals were really clear on this. There is no magic pill. Recovery isn't a one-size-fits-all deal. It takes a whole mix of things. You need strong social support from friends or family, you need professional guidance, and the earlier the intervention, the better. But, and this is the key, none of that matters if people can't actually afford to get the help in the first place.
And this is exactly why those customized, individual plans are so critical. Because a generic approach can sometimes do more harm than good. One professional mentioned how some clients just get stuck going over their history again and again, while for others, counseling actually made them feel worse because it was re-traumatizing. The help has to fit the person, not the other way around.
Ultimately, the journey towards healing so often starts with one incredibly courageous step. As the psychotherapist Rosie explains, just being open, just being able to say to someone, "This happened to me, but I'm working on it now," that is such a powerful act. That's how you start to break the cycle of silence and shame. So if there's one big takeaway here, it's that healing from trauma is not a journey you can take alone. It requires support. And that leaves all of us with a really important question to think about. If resilience is built with support, how do we start building more supportive communities? How do we become the kind of society where recovery isn't just a possibility for the lucky few, but a reality for everyone?